Let's talk about John Gacy. Let's talk about murdering. Let's talk about what an asshole that he was, but now he's dead. Let's talk about Gacy. Hi, everyone, and welcome to Most Hexcellent, the podcast, your true crime, paranormal, all things strange and peculiar comedy podcast. I am Gina, and I am joined by
Danielle, who just had to witness that lovely, sonnet from the times of Shakespeare.
It was beautiful. I am the improv queen. Just kidding. I kind of hate improv. But we are here to finally talk about the infamous John Wayne Gacy Jr. of Des Plaines, Illinois. And this is a big deal for us because obviously everyone knows Gacy. Everyone knows the story. And we spent a lot of time going back and forth between doing him because of that. But because Danielle and I have so many connections to him and so many connections to the case, we thought that it was important to get into more of the background of his victims and the people whose stories deserve to be told, especially around this time of year when the story gets a lot more attention than usual.
And two, I think this case, to me personally, I think is so monumentally, when it's covered, whenever I hear this story, I think even to me, it's just so focused on him that we don't really hear a lot about victim-based, there's no basis for any of his victims' lives. It's kind of just like, oh, this just happened to them and that's it. And we don't really hear anything about the victims. We don't really hear anything about real people who were affected by this person, real families who lost their children to this person. And I think this case, to me, after spending so long researching it and going into, spoiler alert, guys, we decided to go into each of these 33 victims' lives and kind of get a better picture of who this person was and what happened to them and how it affected their family. That's kind of the perspective that we chose to take with this series versus doing a really in-depth deep dive into John Wayne Gacy, because I feel like so many people already know his story. Yes. We know his story. We know all I ever want to know about John Gacy, I know, and I don't really give a fuck. I don't care. So I think that this series to me was kind of really fundamentally changed the way that I look at a lot of how I look at murder victims and the people who do this, because I think to a certain degree when we hear these stories, it's kind of just ooh, I want to listen to this case. It's scary. It's
and that's
crazy.
How it is with a lot of serial killers, and especially for him because he's such this character almost he's the clown. He's Pogo literally. The clown, and people the killer clown of Chicago and Des Plaines and this big story when he was really just a shitty, tiny, angry person who hated himself and took it out on other people. He didn't dress up as a clown and go and murder people. It wasn't this insane Pennywise shit. You know what I mean? It was just sad.
That's the perspective we hear. That's the perspective we hear a lot. And I think researching this case fundamentally changed a lot of how I look at kind of when I'm researching things or what I'm interested in. That this case changed a lot of that for me, just in terms of when you read these people's stories, and I have nephews who are every single age that he murdered victims at, and that changes it to think of oh, okay, because most of the time we're reading about women, so we're reading about our story. We could at any time be that person, but I think it's different when you think of the fact of I have nephews who are all of these ages. I have nephews who are 14. I have nephews who are 20. I have nephews who are 18 years old who could have been victims of this person. So I think that changed a lot of how I looked at this case and kind of humanized it a little bit of you have to look at victims as people and you have to tell their stories versus a sensationalized story about this jackass who literally just it has become this legend because he wore a clown suit. It's not this story that I kind of thought it was, or no matter how many times I've heard about it, I think it's still just, after reading this, it just became so much more, he became so much smaller reading this story, or reading about his story.
And it's even so interesting, we've talked about this before on our Killer Connections episode early on, and our connections that Danielle's cousin Nick had with them at the pizza place that he worked with where we grew up in Elmwood Park. we'll get into later, one of his victims was actually from Elmwood Park as well, which I didn't even know going into this. But I have a distant cousin on my mother's side of my family who was actually murdered by him, and another cousin on that same side of the family who was almost abducted by him. And this family member was kind enough to share his story with me. So on our second episode, we're going to get into more people's personal stories with him, which I'm really excited to do.
Yeah.
Because you don't really see that. You don't get those stories of people who got away. You know what I mean? And it's just like, I won't get into it yet, but a little bit of what he told me was just, you know, like, he was like, I didn't tell anyone for years after. Because it's like, you're almost ashamed of, like, when you're, like, a young man, and you're like, that could have been me, especially in the 70s.
Especially during this time. Yeah, especially during this time period. It's, like, and it's a constant thing that we see with every single victim of John Wayne Gacy of, like, this person, like, everyone views these children as, like, oh, they're boys. Right. So it's kind of like, oh, you know what I mean? It's like they're rough and tumble. They can take care of themselves. They're probably just a runaway. It's that narrative over and over because they're men, because these are male victims. This makes this case all that much more sad, but also really interesting because you have such a large basis of male victims, which you don't really see a lot.
Right. So I guess we can just start from the beginning and
we can
go from there, correct? So,
yeah.
John Wayne Gacy was born March 17th, 1942, and was an American serial killer and sex offender known as the Killer Clown, who assaulted and murdered at least 33 young men and boys. And not all of these young men and boys were identified after it happened.
No, there's still, I think, about 7 or 8 who are still remain unidentified.
Yes. So basically, so he grew up in a very abusive household.
Yeah, so I have some info about just his parents. We could talk a little bit before we go into childhood. It's just kind of the general basis of his parents.
Yes, go for it.
He was born to John Stanley Gacy and Marion Elaine Robinson Gacy, who are buried at Mary Hill Catholic Cemetery and Mausoleum, which is 20 minutes away from us in Des Plaines. His dad was a World War I veteran, and his mom was just a homemaker at that time.
Stay-at-home, yeah.
Stay-at-home mom. So he was actually named after John Wayne. His dad was super, like, ultimate.
His dad was strung out on John Wayne.
His dad was actually Lady Gaga.
No. Yep.
No, so his dad was super ultimate epitome of just, like, all things toxic masculinity is what his dad wanted to be. So his dad named him after John Wayne because he was this beautiful, amazing symbol of American masculinity at the time.
Right.
And so that kind of set up a lot of expectations of what he expected his son to be, and kind of where a lot of John's conditioning about himself came from is from his dad. Yes. So we're going to see how that comes into play a lot later. But he also had 2 sisters named Joanne and Karen, and we're going to be talking a little bit about them later. So I wanted to just bring that up, that he did have 2 sisters. And one of his sisters actually has recently just started to speak a lot more about him, and she went on Oprah.
Really?
So, yeah. I think it's Karen. Karen went on and has been talking.
Of course it's Karen.
It's Karen. So Karen is the one who kind of talks more about it. And I think even, like, hearing her story kind of brought another dimension to it of, like, yeah, this is just somebody's brother, but he's also a monster. So that kind of thing that happens where you're like, what if this was my dad? What if this was my brother? It kind of comes into play when, like, hearing their stories. I was like, Jesus, like, you really kind of don't know what kind of people you're dealing with until something like this happens where you're like, holy shit.
Right. And growing up, and that masculinity affected him a lot too, even with his body image, because, you know, his dad wanted him to be this, you know, typical, you know, boy playing sports and doing all that kind of stuff. And because of that, his mother babied him a lot more and babied him with food.
Yes.
Which led him to become a pretty heavy kid growing up, which made it worse for being bullied. And he also spent a lot of time with his mom, like, cooking and gardening. Yeah. And because of that, his dad was like, what, do you want to be, like, a girl? Are you a girl? And basically just, like, was bullied by his own father. And his dad just, like, gave up on him and was like, you're a homosexual because you're not good at playing catch in the backyard and you can't play football, you know?
Because his dad actually used to beat him. So his childhood was extremely abusive. His dad used to beat him and constantly do the thing of just, like, emasculating him.
Mm-hmm.
And because John had a heart condition, if you guys don't know.
Yes.
It was called heart arrhythmia, and he really couldn't participate in sports or gym the way that,
so he couldn't do football, like be a quarterback, you know?
Yeah, he couldn't do the things that his dad typically expected of him because of the fact that he did have a heart condition, and it made it extremely hard for him to participate in those sports or to kind of do the things that a typical he was growing up in the 50s. So, like, 50s or 60s dad, what the expectation was, he couldn't meet it. So it just made it much more hard for his dad, and also he was the only boy.
Yes.
So his dad also, like, that placed so much more weight on him versus if he had a brother who could fill those needs for the dad, it would be a different story, I think. But he's the only boy of two, and there's just two girls. So it's really hard for his dad to kind of just accept that his son is not what he wants him to be. And his dad was, like, garbage anyway, so it doesn't matter. But
right.
That and also comes into play.
Yeah, so then you have later on, you have him around in 1954, he confided in Barry Buscemi when he was in Boy Scouts.
It was Steve Buscemi.
It was not Steve Buscemi.
He confided in Steve Buscemi.
He was sitting with Steve Buscemi. Steve Buscemi was putting on lipstick and crossing off people off a list that he was going to kill with John Wayne Gacy. Mm-hmm. And that's how they got that part in Billy Madison.
Mm-hmm.
No. So he was in Boy Scouts with him, and he confided in him saying that he stole his mom's bra and underwear, and he would put them on and put on lipstick and pretend that he was a woman, and he said that sometimes he wished that he thought he should have been born as a girl.
And then he looked in the mirror and he was like, when we're done, you'll believe God is a woman, and he flipped his long blonde hair behind his back.
No, he said, he put on the lipstick and he said, make it work, Dennis. Make it work. Always Sunny. No, that's not what happened, but it's very sad because, you know, things are just so different now. And you see, like, you know, maybe he was, you know, you don't, like, want to make excuses for people, but it's like, you know, maybe he was, like, non-binary. Maybe but he didn't have that chance to explore his sexuality or his gender because of the reality that he was living in.
And his dad, too. Like he didn't have that chance that I think, which it's a problem today too, but, like, especially during this time period, like, if you had any feminine qualities about you, it was just immediately just dismissed as, like, oh, you're gay. Oh, right. You're this. That's immediately what it was. And his father was also an alcoholic, so that kind of came into the play too of just his dad. His sister used to say this too, of just his dad would just absolutely torture this kid. And his dad would flip so quickly. She just said, like, you always were kind of towing a line with their dad where it was just, he could have flipped at any second. He would get very, very drunk and he would beat their mother, and he would also beat John very severely. His dad, when he was around 6, like, beat him so severely with a broomstick, he actually blacked out. And then around age 11 is where we get our famous kind of McDonald triad head injury of when he got hit with a swing. And so this is, like, kind of typical head injuries that are associated with serial killers. Kind of
so many serial killers with head injuries.
They have head injuries that basically they believe that this causes them to kind of, this, like, switches something on in them where it deletes that inhibition to not kill people, kind of. And so when he was 11, he had that injury, and then he would have, like, regular blackouts, both from his dad's beatings and also from his heart condition. Like, so all of those kind of came together, and he would have these really bad, like, just blackouts. And his dad would literally torture him because he was like, oh, well, you're just a sissy because you have blackouts. And he would think that John was just faking it because the doctors kind of couldn't figure out what was wrong with him. And so, which, you know, of course, they're not going to be like, oh, your dad's beating the shit out of you. That's probably what it is. So the doctors kind of couldn't put a diagnosis on it. So they essentially were just believing that, oh, well, we can't figure it out. And his dad was like, well, if you can't figure it out, nothing's wrong with him, then he's just like a pussy. Okay, whatever.
Right.
It's kind of what his dad used to say.
Yeah, and his dad literally told him that he would rather his son be dead than find out he was a homosexual.
Yeah.
So you can really see what kind of man this is.
Yeah.
And what kind of house Gacy was growing up in.
Yep.
Yes.
So I have a little bit more about JC.
JC in the house.
JC. No, I have a little bit more about his childhood and kind of just some general tidbits and a case that I've never heard of this. But this is a suspected one of Gacy's first victims is what we're going to talk about. So going along with what we were talking before, Stanley was extremely homophobic. He passes this trait down to his son, who kind of just suppresses it, and it really, I think, comes out when in these murders, because he's just this like bottled up rage that comes out from, which is no excuse. No one's excusing anything, but he kind of like, when he's murdering these victims, it's kind of like, I'm murdering a part of myself, because he just hated the fact that which I think that John was generally probably bisexual.
Yes.
That's what we're going to put his
And you see that later
as.
on, too, especially when he does go to prison and things like that. Like, we'll see it, like, so much later that, like, a lot of this is coming out from his suppressed sexuality.
Yeah. So we're going to say on this podcast that John is bisexual. So that's what we're not putting him as straight, or, like, he's not straight, he's not gay, fully, whatever.
Yeah.
So we're just saying he is bisexual, because I think he did have interest in women, and he also had interest in men. So, yeah. So he basically suppresses his bisexuality so much that he just comes to kind of just hate it so much. And he really embodies the same traits that his dad did in just absolutely hating anyone who is homosexual.
Yeah.
So because of this fact, he actually never tells his dad that he was molested by a friend of his father's who was a contractor.
Mm-hmm.
He would take John, he was about 30, and I think John was maybe like 6 or 7 at the time, maybe a little bit older. He would take John out for ice cream, and then, well, okay, first of all, before we get into any of this, trigger warnings for anybody who is a victim of sexual assault, sexual molestation. Mm-hmm. This is a big case for all of that is going to be coming into play later. So if you're not in a space to listen to that right now, you can pause this and then come back to it at a later date. But just wanted to give everyone a forewarning before we get into any of this. So, warning.
Yes.
So he would take John out for ice cream and then do what Gacy later did, which was he would put people in wrestling holds. He would put John in a wrestling hold and put Gacy's head between his legs.
And it's like, this is a 7-year-old boy with a 30-year-old man.
Yeah. And his dad was like, because he was a contractor and a friend, he was like a casual friend of the dad's, and John had always kind of been interested in, like contracting work, which this guy did. Like, he'd been interested in building houses and doing all this stuff. So he wanted to kind of go on a tour with this guy and just kind of see what he was doing. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And it's just like such a little kid thing of like wanting to do a police ride along. I want to see what this is. Right. I want to see what this is. And just, this guy just took advantage of him. I think he was actually 5 when this happened. And this man was like in his 30s. So he was very young. Very young. Yeah. And then also, I think that was when he was older. But there was also another incident that happened when he was 5 where a 15-year-old girl who was a friend of the family, she took John up to her room and she fondled him. And the mom came upstairs. Both their mothers came upstairs, but her mother actually slapped her when she found her doing that. And it kind of just never got discussed after that. And,
Jesus.
Yeah. So he said, this is a quote from John, where he just said, "My dad was domineering. My dad drank a lot. And when he drank a lot, he was abusive to my mother and me. But I never swung at my dad because I loved him for what he stood for." So this is kind of just to wrap up what John's childhood was like, is that he had a very abusive father. And he had a very hard childhood. And he couldn't tell his dad any of this. Like, his family kind of didn't really know any of what went on. But he still kind of held this, like, love and regard for his dad, regardless of what happened. So.
Right.
Yeah. And then this is an alleged first, which we're always be on this podcast, always believe the victim. So we're not even going to say this is alleged. I hold this as this could actually have happened. So this is the case of David Bolton, who lived in Arlington Heights. He is believed to be one of the first victims of Gacy around 1957 when, David was 10 years old and John was around 15, I think. So this happened up in Wisconsin, and a lawyer who actually worked on the John Wayne Gacy case actually told David that John could have been working in Wisconsin at this time when he was a teenager. So he couldn't. Okay. So David can't prove that it was actually Gacy who did this, but he remembers it. Like, when he's seen Gacy on the TV, he actually remembered it and was like, "Oh, okay, this is who it was."
Okay.
So once he actually seen that Gacy had been apprehended, he knew that, like, oh, this is the person who did this. So David actually went up to have a vacation with his mother at a little resort in Wisconsin. And it was a lake between Chicago and Milwaukee. He didn't say exactly where it was, but there's several resorts that happen, like, up between Chicago and Wisconsin, because there's all these, like, beautiful lakeside cabins.
I wonder if it
and stuff
was
like
Eagle River, because I have some family who who live by Eagle River and who
It
take
could have been.
vacations up there.
Because there's
Possibly.
so many like nice little
Right.
resorts over there.
It was Wisconsin Dells.
It was
They
actually
went
the Wisconsin
to
Dells.
the Polynesian Village. What is it? What's over there?
I think it's called the Polynesian Resort, or he went to like the nice the Noah's Ark, where John was working as a ride operator.
Yep.
And just sending boys straight down the tubes, you know?
Oh my god.
He was at Noah's Ark, where I think like a child literally like got stuck in this they had a they like launched this beautiful ride, which was like, oh, it's the first water slide to go upside down, and someone like got stuck in the loop. So
you know what? That's
it was
worst nightmare.
How hard would you scream if you literally got stuck? I
wouldn't scream. I would just pass away. Is what I would do.
I would put my arms on my chest, cross them, and just literally just pass.
And
away
ladies and
into
gentlemen,
God's
arms. The child who got stuck in that ride was a young John Wayne Gacy.
It actually was.
And this is.
John Wayne Gacy got stuck in that ride in like 2003.
He got stuck in the tubes. He was like Augustus Gloop when he gets stuck in the fucking chocolate tube.
He was.
And he went into the furnace room, and this is where this all began.
Just kidding. How it all started. So, back to our horrible story. So he meets John Wayne Gacy there, and he was one of several boys who were present on this, who are like at the resort. So he was one of the older ones though, because there's a bunch of like 10-year-old kids and younger that David was kind of hanging out with, and then John was the oldest one. Okay. So they went out together on a fishing trip, just David and John, and
when 10-year-olds and 15-year-olds just go on fishing trips in Wisconsin.
Yeah. I mean, David kind of came from a really abusive household himself, so I think it was just like his mom wasn't exactly...
Right. It was the Andy Griffith days, where he and Opie just went out to the lake to do some fishing.
Yeah, and it was just normal.
Yeah.
So, he actually reports that, like, Gacy made him kill frogs on this trip and just, like, hang them over tree branches. Like, it was just really gross. He just said that, like, when they went out together, they couldn't catch any fish. And this was one of Gacy's days off, so they kind of just spent the day together and caught fish. Or, like, they couldn't catch any fish, so they killed frogs.
Can you imagine what a horrible movie Gacy's Day Off would be?
What?
Instead of Ferris Bueller's Day Off,
it would literally just be, like,
frogs.
Weekend at Bernie's is what it would be.
Ew.
Just, like, him carting around a dead body, to be honest.
God.
So, a few days later, John asked him if he wanted to go for a hike around this lake. So, they go off together alone, and he proceeds to take David to a thicket, and he brutally raped David, and he tells David that if he doesn't comply, then he will throw him in the lake, and then he'll just say that he drowned, and he basically told him, like, this happens to people all the time, like, no one will ever believe that anything happened to you.
And this is when he's 15 years old.
He's 15, allegedly, for this.
God. Can you imagine having that mindset when you're 15 years old?
Dude, I can't imagine how this kid, like, this is just so... Reading this kid's story just made me so freaking sad, because I was just like, this is just terrible. To be 10 years old and be, to have this happen to you, like, I can't even imagine how that feels. Like, it's just terrible.
Right. It's like when I was 15, I was just worried about, like, getting a chocolate milkshake after school at Goodies.
When I was
down
15,
the street.
I was brutally worried about, you know, the worries of Pete Wentz and if he was doing fine with all the money I gave him. Like, that was my main worry and concern. So, like...
Not this.
This is just terrible. So, David actually never ended up telling his mom because, like I said, he came from a very abusive home and he knew that it kind of just wouldn't be received well. And so this is obviously, like, something that really haunted him his entire life. And he had a lot of just emotional issues and a really just up and down life as a result of this. And so he said, quote, "I think of it every day of my life. I wish I could erase it. I'm glad he's dead."
And that's on that.
And that's on that. And so that's the case of David Bolton. And I just really wanted to highlight that because, like, this has real lasting impacts on people. And it's just terrible. And it just hurts your heart to hear stuff like that. So
exactly. And it just gets worse from here.
It's just getting worse,
so
guys.
Let's go.
I'm so sorry. So now we're going to move into kind of when John gets to be on his own, which he finally, like, he'd been abused until he was literally 20 years old, when he finally gets away from his house and leaves his god-awful father in 1962. And this is when he moves to Las Vegas to become a mortuary assistant. And so this is where we get...
What a lifestyle.
What an absolute trailblazer. No, I'm just kidding. So this is where we get his first experience with, like, borderline disgusting necrophilia. And this story haunts my every waking moment, to be quite honest. But
I don't think I've heard this one.
you have to have. Yes, you have.
Did they talk about it on last podcast?
They must have. Yes,
I don't remember.
This is the traditional story. He becomes a mortuary assistant, and late one night he proceeds to lay in the coffin of a dead boy.
Oh, yes. Now I remember.
So this is when he lays. He just lays in this coffin with this dead boy. He just like climbs on in. He's like, he's like scooch over, and he just gets in there. So he just lays. I just got chills all over. It's just disgusting.
I'm just like making noises.
It's
sorry.
Just like, I feel like the cat, like when you know how when your cat's like hold back will just roll when it's puking. Like that's like how I feel listening to that story. I'm just like full body rolls.
Right.
He's like back rolls.
Back rolls.
Back rolls.
Alyssa Edwards, everyone.
I love Alyssa
Anyway.
Edwards. So this ends up really scaring him, and it kind of was like, oh shit, I can't believe I did that. And so he
scaring him. Can you imagine like another assistant at the mortuary? It's like he like forgot his keys, and he's like, oh, I just gotta go back real quick. I left my keys on the table. He goes back and he sees John Wayne Gacy getting into the coffin with this boy, and he immediately full body rolls, but like on the ground, he like tucks his legs in, and he does like, a backflip out of there.
He literally probably got on all fours, like starts to dry heave, like just pukes up his nice fish dinner from the stand down the street, and he just backflips the fuck out of there. He's like, I'm so sorry, I gotta go.
I would. That didn't happen at all, but I'm assuming it would have if that was the situation.
If it was me, oh my god.
If that was the shit situation, that's what would have happened.
Okay. So, now we're going to get down to when John moves down to good old Springfield, Illinois, which is where Lincoln lived. And it's a really good time down there. I love Springfield. I've been there before. And I've never been. Okay, it's probably a great time. Will. It's a really good time. They have like
what's there? Like an outhouse and like the Lincoln Museum? It's
Lincoln's old house and the Lincoln Museum. And then you go and you sit in a theater at the Lincoln Museum, and then you watch the whole thing about Lincoln. And then there's cannons in the side of the theater, okay? It was the most amazing experience of my whole life. I literally
Please tell me that John Gacy was like a reenactor and he got to like fire the cannons.
He actually was.
Okay, but imagine how happy he would have been if he was. Maybe he would have never like killed anyone, and if they just let him be a reenactor at the Lincoln Museum.
If they let him reenact our great president, Abraham Lincoln, then this would have never happened. And that's on period.
And that's
on that. So this is where he meets his wife Marilyn, and this is who he has his children with. So he has 2 children, and they have,
because she was connected to Springfield politics.
Of course.
And that's why he was interested. Part of the reason why he was interested in her, because he's a control freak. He wanted to control people. Mm-hmm. So he's like, I'm going to marry this woman who is connected to these politics here and up my status.
And then he played Power and Control by Marina and the Diamond. He was like, yes, absolutely.
No, he didn't.
So this is where he meets Marilyn. She's involved with the politics. So he's like, yes, absolutely.
Marilyn Myers. Yes.
Yeah. So he meets her, and they get married, and after he gets married and kind of settles in, that's when his dad finally admits to him, like, oh, I'm so proud of you, and he says, son, I was wrong about you. Which, like, what the fuck is that, Stan? Like, what is that going to do for me? What is that? Is that going to fix my whole abusive childhood now that you were wrong about me? Like, oh, thank God. I've been waiting so long to hear those words.
And me, when I like got a job, my dad, I was wrong about you.
I was wrong about
you. Me, when I like, I don't know, like cook an actual meal or like don't look like trash. I'm so proud of you. I was completely wrong about you.
This is like literally just the words of my father anytime that I admit that America is like a flawed country. Where I'm just like, yeah, you know what, Dad, you're right. Italy is just so good. It's so much better. And he's like, son, I was wrong about you.
Yep, that's exactly what Vincenz says.
That's exactly what Vincenz does. But this is actually, so her dad gives way to the most beautiful experience, which is that her dad owns like a series of KFCs of Kentucky Fried Chicken, and lets John manage like 3 of them. So he actually forces his employees to call him the Colonel. He
actually owns the KFC Sephoras.
Oh my God.
The chains.
Amazing.
The connections. Yes.
So he owns the KFC Sephoras, and he's just like piping out that new Stila palette. He's doing really well. He's eating chicken. So this is actually a story, another one that I found, of an employee who actually worked for him in Cedar Falls, Iowa. So they moved to Iowa, essentially, is
Right.
where these Kentucky Fried Chickens are, and that he goes to manage them in Iowa. So this employee who worked with him as a teenager was named Gil Gutnecht. Good old
Okay.
Gil Gutnecht. He was 16 in 1967 when he worked for Gacy. So, okay, this is not funny, but it's kind of funny.
None of this is funny.
None
but
of this
like,
is funny, but it's kind of hysterical. Just this
Right.
story is funny because Gil is like, I was reading this to a friend of the show, Ashley, and we had a good laugh about this. So he reported that Gacy used to knee the employees in the back of the thighs.
You mean you to me when I walk down the street? Danielle and I have this thing where like she walks like ridiculously close to you and she like has no sense of like where she's going.
Yeah.
And so in the summer whenever I'm wearing sandals, she'll step on the back of my heels, like not on purpose, but now I'm at the point where I think she does it on purpose, and she always like takes my shoe off with her foot because she steps on the back of my heel. We were in London one time walking through traffic, and she stepped on the back of my shoe, and my chocolate came off in the middle of and I almost got hit by a London taxi. And if anyone's been there, they know those things don't stop for shit. And I almost died multiple times. This bitch is always stepping on my sandals.
Yeah.
So you know what? I wouldn't be surprised if that was the same shit that he was pulling and was trying to take everyone's shoes off.
John Wayne Gacy was just stepping. Someone's like
He's stepping on everyone's chocolate.
He's sitting on the fryer. Like, people are just sitting there just frying this chicken, and they're all wearing, like, Adidas chocolates, and he just steps on the back of their chocolates and just takes them all off.
He ruins their Gucci slides.
He ruins everyone's Gucci slides. I think they said that minimum wage was, like, $1.50 at this time or something. So, like,
kill me.
Imagine buying Gucci slides with your $1.50
Imagine
job.
working at KFC for
John Wayne
$1.50
Gacy.
and having John Wayne Gacy fucking knee you in the back of the shins. I'd
You'd
rather
walking around just
die.
checking the shit out of everyone. I love it.
Actually, that's a bad joke. I wouldn't rather die because in this situation, that
You might.
line doesn't work out. In any other situation, I would rather die. But in this, I would not. I would rather live, but not work at KFC and get kneed in the shins by John Wayne Gacy.
Literally, this is like the episode of Supernatural where he like gets kidnapped by these hillbillies who just like kill people. Like, they're all like the fam that just kills people. They're supposed to be based in the Benders. And so...
Oh, didn't they also do that in American Horror Story in Roanoke? They have the hillbilly family?
Yeah. It's just like the Benders. So, like, literally, Dean looks at the guy and he goes, "Eat me." He goes, No, wait. Actually, you actually might. So, no. So, like, that's literally what the case is.
Why does everything always has to go back to Supernatural?
And what?
But it's fine.
And
anyway.
what? Okay?
So he's kneeing people. He's taking off their Gucci chanclas.
He's straight up, like, smacking the Gucci's right off these people's, just right off their good old feet while they're cooking chicken. So, okay, I'm sorry.
We're never going to get through this episode.
So, Gil and the other young boys that were working, Gacy would walk up behind them and deliver a knee to the back of their thighs, is what he said. And so he said... Okay, I'm so sorry. So he said he was one of the most Republican... Hold on. I said he was one of the most sadistic people I ever met.
He was one of the most Republican people I've ever met, which is same as the most sadistic people you've ever met anyway.
No, he said he was one of the most sadistic... Oh my god, I'm so sorry. So he was one of the most sadistic people I ever met, the independent Republican representative from Rochester said. I never saw anyone else who would do that. It was such a sadistic act.
Danielle is losing her shit right now.
I'm just crying because I'm like, there's people who straight up torture animals and like are terrible. And he's like, yeah, this guy
kneeing people in the thigh.
In the back of the thigh. What a fucking sadist. Oh my god, I'm so sorry. It just makes me laugh so hard. He was just like, I never saw anyone else who would do that. It was such a sadistic act. I'm like... And
they're just like watching him do this and not saying anything. No one's like, hey, John, can you like fucking cut that out, please? Like,
someone looks at him with the... What's the guy's
like,
name?
We're gonna fucking call HR. But like, they're just watching him. They're like, that was the most sadistic
HR was literally
shit.
John Gacy, though. So literally... He was just going around. He was kicking people in the back of the knees. He was doing what you do.
He was kicking ass and taking names.
He was snapping necks and cashing checks. So, oh my god, he really was though. Oh no. So, this guy is actually, he comes forward and he says that Gacy at other times would actually just deliver a good-natured punch to his workers' shoulders. And he said, but it still hurt. So Gil is just saying that he used to, like, give him a good-natured punch in the shoulder. And they were like, he said, but it still hurt. I'm like, well, of course it did, Gil. Every punch hurts. Okay.
The first punch is the deepest.
Yep. So he says that he would decline several offers to go to stag nights at Gacy's house, but some of his other coworkers actually came back and they went, like, everything was fine. So he would have these stag parties at his house where he would essentially, I think, just have, like, a membership program where he would just, like, I don't know, like, he would send you, like, 3 porn films for the price of $3.95, like, mail in now.
What?
No. He was running a subscription service out of his house.
I thought you were serious. I was like, did he have, like, subscription boxes? and like, people did, like, unboxings?
He was like, yeah, really quick. I just have the subscription service.
He's like, let me do these swatches.
I have a quick swatch of what's in the box. I think you're really going to love it. Thank you so much.
By the way, Danielle just, like, has her cat casually on her lap right now. Just, like, talking about this story.
He wanted to come over. He's interested. Aren't you, son? So he would have these stag parties where he would essentially just invite employees in, and he would just have them, like, come in. They would watch porn. They would play pool. And they would just drink liquor. And he would just be like...
You know, just guys being dudes.
Just guys dudes being dudes.
Guys.
Dudes being
the
guys.
Bears. Sausages. Literally.
Yeah, that's literally what they did.
Yeah.
So he would actually play pool with the boys and tell them, like, oh, hey, if you win, I'll blow you. And if I win, then you have to blow me. Which is, like...
I'm sorry, that's not funny. But, like, okay.
My cat's eyes are so wide right now. He's like, I can't believe this shit. So he'd be like, oh, like, blow me down, bang, bang. You'll hit the ground, bang, bang. Is what he's telling this boy.
We need to edit that out.
So, literally, this is, like, the kind of shit that John is up to during this time. And he would actually tell these boys that he was authorized by the Illinois governor to perform, like, this is when the time he moved back to Chicago. So, eventually, at some point, he moves back to Chicago, and he's still on his bullshit. So, he would actually tell these boys that he was authorized by the Illinois governor to perform a study on homosexual behavior and that they would be, like, basically compensated for their time.
Yes.
So he was just running a whole study.
And that governor was Rod Blagojevich. Just kidding.
Exactly. So he would, like, say, like, he would actually, like, pay them for this. Or, like, I think he actually would charge just a fee to get into the stag party. Like, he'd be like, yeah, give me $1.
So you had to pay to go to a shitty party where you might get blown by John Wayne Gacy and then he did a homosexual study on you? It sounds like the worst fucking party of all time.
They had nothing to do in the 1970s. Like, what were you supposed to do? Roller skate down the block and get a blister?
Play, like, hopscotch or something. Go to Hobby Lobby and, like, get, like, chalk and, like, hang out on your porch.
Read a book. Start a business.
Eat ass, suck a dick, and sell drugs.
I mean, they could have done all of that, okay?
Right.
For the low price of $19.95, and they didn't. They didn't subscribe to the John Wayne Gacy subscription box, and this is what happened.
No.
So, basically, it was all just, like, fun and games trying to get people to blow him, which, you know, okay. So, we're going to move to, unless you have anything else, we're going to move to one of the first kind of instances of where we get John going to prison and actually having some consequences for his actions.
Is this Donald Voorhees?
Yes, it is.
Yes.
So we are moving...
Old Donnie V.
Old Donnie V. I'm pretty sure that Donald Voorhees would rather die than be called Old Donnie V, but that's fine.
I don't think he would. Don't think that's a thing.
Okay. So this is March of 1968 when Donald Voorhees, who was 15 at this time, he would pay Voorhees to essentially just molest him at motels after, like, getting Donald drunk. So there was several just instances of him just getting Donald drunk or high or whatever and just molesting him at hotels or, like, forcing Donald to give him oral sex or, like, things like that. So
right. And he would pay him, like, $50 in exchange for his silence.
Yeah, essentially.
And to not talk about it.
And when you're 15 and a boy in the 1960s...
That's already traumatizing enough.
Yeah.
You don't know what's going on with your body. Like, you're still growing.
Yeah.
You got a lot going on. Like, I can't even imagine.
It's just freaking horrible. And then you have another employee at KFC who was Edward Lynch. So this is all taking place. We're still in Iowa, but all the stag parties and stuff like that, it would happen between Iowa and Chicago.
Okay.
So when he was in Chicago is when he started the whole thing of like, the Illinois governor has come here to tell me to ask you to blow me. And they were like,
Yes.
oh my God, amazing, great.
They were like, exactly, makes sense.
Makes sense, sure. So this is all happening when he's still in Iowa in March of 1968. So Edward Lynch, who was 16 years old at the time and he was an employee at KFC, he was invited to Gacy's house and Gacy offers the blowjob trick. He's like, hey, whoever wins, like...
Why wouldn't you just offer fried chicken? I feel like that gets everyone in.
That's what I would like to know. I'd be like, listen, if you blow me, I'll give you 15 chicken thighs or something like that. At least
I'll give you a bucket of chicken.
I'll give you a bucket of chicken or something.
A biscuit.
And a biscuit and some gravy. No, not worth it. So these are all underage boys, by the way. So he's just disgustingly gross and a pedophile. So Edward got invited to Gacy's house, and Gacy offers him the blowjob to whoever wins at pool, and then he basically, like, lets Edward win and gets mad when Edward is like, hey, no thank you, I don't want to get blown, no thank you, not today. Like,
right, but it's also like, why are you there? Because, like, you know the game already. You know what the prize is. It's not a bucket of chicken. It's a blowjob from this gross man who kicks people in the back of the thighs at KFC. Like, I don't...
Well, they're all, like, young. That's the thing. Like, everyone's just young, and, like, you have someone who's letting you drink and play pool and watch porn. So, like, of course they're all gonna go over there. And, like, no one's, like, going anywhere expecting to get, like, molested. Like, it's just gross. Like, and he's, like, taking advantage of these kids and basically just being, like... and I think that all of them at this time are thinking that he's not really serious. Because... even if he had been offering this to people at this point, okay? Mm-hmm. So he's been offering this, like, even if he was like, hey, if you win this game, I'll blow you, like, LOL. I don't think that anyone thought he was really serious because nothing has come out, because people are still coming back from these stag parties just being like, oh, it's a good time. Like, it's not not an issue. And so it was just like, yeah, okay, whatever. Like, John's kind of weird. He does this or, like, whatever. So no one's actually thinking that he's serious until we get to, like, this incident. And you're like, oh, yeah, John is actually just a fucking pedophile. So he actually just turns down this offer from Gacy. He's like, yeah, no, thank you. I think it's either that he lets John win, or, like, John lets him win, or he lets John win, or, like, or not that he lets John win. Like, it's either the case of, like, he wanted to be blown, or Edward, he said, like, oh, I'm going to blow you, or, like, whatever. It was one of those two scenarios that happened where... essentially it was like either someone's getting a blowjob or someone's like giving a blowjob, and Edward was like, no thank you. And so Gacy gets really mad. He slices Edward's arm, and then he kind of like calms down. Like, he's really enraged, and then he calms down and he patches it up.
He's like, hey, it's just a joke, man. It's fine. It's just guys being dudes.
It's literally what like Gacy would be like. He would just like on a dime just like switch and be like, oh, whatever. It's not what you think it means, whatever. So which, this is, like, how fucked it was, where, like, Edward really wanted to leave, but Gacy kind of just convinces him to stay. And he attempts to show him this cuff trick of, like, ooh, ta-da, I can get out of cuffs, cool.
Yes.
And so Edward is actually just really smart, and when Gacy gets the cuff on him, he kind of, so he either, I think he gets the cuffs on Edward, and he starts to kind of choke him. And Edward just immediately pretends to just black out. He's like, oh, okay, like, I'm going to play dead. So then after this, like, I guess he, like, blacks out, kind of freaks Gacy out, and Gacy's like, oh, okay, whatever. You know, like, let's, like, get, like, eases up and is like, okay, whatever. And then Gacy pretends that this is only a joke. He's like, yeah, maybe I cuffed you and I choked you, but it was just a joke.
Right. He was like, I started a joke.
Yeah.
That left the whole world crying.
That's it. So Edward started singing
was
that.
On me.
Edward started singing that, and then Gacy was like, you know what, you gotta leave.
He's like, I'm sorry, like,
he made that motion with his hand where he, like, goes by his throat. He was like,
hey,
cut it.
Cut it. Oh my God. But also didn't, I'm sorry if I'm, like, getting ahead of you and you're gonna mention it, but after all the things with Donald Voorhees, didn't, like, he eventually break down and tell his parents?
Oh yeah, that's what we're getting to. Don't worry. Okay. And so this whole Edward incident actually happens while Gacy's wife is in the hospital giving birth.
Yes.
So he was like, really quick, my wife is pushing this child out of her vagina, but, like, don't worry, fam. I'm going to be here trying to molest this child and murder him, but it's not a problem.
Right.
So he basically just, after this happens, says, like, oh, it was just a joke. He sings him that song, and then he takes him the fuck home. So a few...
No, he doesn't sing him that... Wait, does he? Yes. No. Edward is the... Who's... it's Edward? What's his name?
Edward is the one... Edward Lynch is a 16-year-old.
Edward is the one singing the song.
Edward is the one singing the song, yes.
And then John joins him.
John, they join in. They do a nice technique. Like, they just do the nice duet together, and they're, like, living. And then he takes him home.
Yes. Real facts.
Real facts that happen. So a few months later is when Donald finally tells his family what happens, and he just breaks down to his parents after Gacy was mentioned, and he just has, like, a complete, like, breakdown and tells his parents, like, what has been happening. And, of course, this is kind of, like...
His parents were involved in Springfield politics, too. Wasn't one of them, like, a senator? Because they were like big time in the politics, so his parents were important people.
Yeah, his parents were like important people. I think
was why it was such a big deal.
Yeah, and this is why this kind of like this could have just been another case of like, oh, he's just like the local town pedophile, like whatever, like. But this case becomes really polarizing in this, which not to say, oh, whatever, he's a pedophile. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that this became a bigger thing in the community because everyone really did like John. So there are people who believe Donald. And there's people who are just like, oh, he's just lying. Because everyone's like, oh, Gacy is the best. He's great. Like, you're just, whatever. Because Edward and Donald actually had gotten together and kind of pieced together that, oh, okay, so this is like kind of happened to both of us. And it's like, oh, okay, this man is just a monster. So in December of 1968, Gacy finally gets charged with oral sodomy. And he orders another member of the KFC gang named Russell Schroeder to actually beat up Donald. But this doesn't work because freaking Donald is like, he's ready. He's a black belt. No, I don't think he's a black belt. But Donald was like ready, and he actually gets the jump on Russell, so he doesn't end up getting beaten up the way that Gacy
right, because he's hiring fucking kids. He's hiring KFC employees to beat the shit out of each other. And, like, my guy, that's not going to work.
It's not going to work out for you.
You're a grown-ass man.
And so he basically tries to get this kid to basically intimidate Donald to not kind of testify against him and not...
Because that's what you do when you're a grown-ass man is you pay...
16.
Was this kid also a teenager?
This kid, I think, was a teenager, too, yeah.
You pay one teenager to beat up another teenager, and you're like, this is going to work. This is solid. This is going to go through. No one's going to talk
100%,
after this.
100%. So Russell Schroeder actually ends up turning on Gacy, like, que surprise. And so he turns on Gacy, and he gets sentenced to 10 years. But, of course,
Gacy gets sentenced to 10 years.
Gacy gets sentenced to 10 years. And he only serves, how many months, Gina? Like, how many months do you think he serves?
I know how many months he serves.
If you were like, you were a plebeian on the street, I'm Billy on the street, I present a tiny microphone in front of your
Billy
face.
on the street? They're like, miss, for $1. How long did John Wayne Gacy serve in prison? I would say maybe 6 months
18.
at the time. But
18 months.
I thought it was 16.
I think my sources said 18. It could be anywhere from 16 to 18 months.
16 to 18 months?
In the Iowa State Men's Reformatory or the NMLS
But also,
State
before
Penitentiary.
that, sorry to interrupt you, and we'll go back on that too, because I just completely interrupted you. But it's like in Trixie and Katya, when Katya's like, you need to stop interrupting me. And then she finally stops her in like the most recent episode. She's like, shh. But, no, but didn't he... When this happens, John Wayne Gacy is like, I didn't do it. Like, you can give me a lie detector test.
And he fails.
And they give him the lie detector test, and he fails the fucking lie detector test. And they're like, well. And then the Curb Your Enthusiasm music starts playing. It's like, and then they just zoom in on him.
They just like zoom in on his face, and he's like, well.
Right. And while he was in prison.
Clown makeup.
Yes, no. But while he was in prison, he was kind of like, he wasn't really bothered there because since he was the KFC manager and he was like the only person in that prison who knew how to season food, they had him working in the kitchen. Mm-hmm. And like everyone liked him and didn't fuck with him because they're like, if we fuck with him, he's not going to season our chicken anymore or season our mashed potatoes. So we have to be nice to him. So he was actually on a television cooking special called Christmas at Anamosa. Mm-hmm. And they have an interview with him, and they're interviewing him, and they're like, he's got his little, like, chef's hat on. And they're like, he literally has, like, like those little, like, cook hats?
Yeah.
And they're like, oh, like, how long have you been here? And he's like, oh, I've been here for about a year and 2 weeks. And they're like, oh, how long do you expect to be here? And he goes, hopefully, not that much longer. I'm like, you fucking piece of shit.
I mean, the thing is,
because he can fucking season food. He knew. And he knew how to charm people.
And he also, what's really funny is that, of course, because he is his father's child, he would not take on homosexual chefs in the kitchen. He'd be like, oh, I'm so sorry. If you're homosexual, you can't work in my fucking kitchen. Even though he himself is a bisexual. So I was like, it's real funny, John. It's just real funny. I just find it really funny. He's like,
I'm sorry, I can't have any of that gay affecting my seasoning.
My seasoning of my chicken.
Like, you're gonna have to get out of here.
Like, I'm so sorry, I have to leave.
Right. But that's another thing is, like, he hated his own sexuality so much, and, like, any of that angered him. And, like you said, that he was able to turn on a dime where, in one instance, he actually saw 2 inmates having oral sex, and he bashed one of their heads in so bad that they blacked out and, like, almost killed him because he saw that. And he was like, not in my house.
Even though that's,
and
like,
then he
not
put
your
chicken
business.
Seasoning on
the
them.
thing is, like, mind your business. It's prison.
Right, but he was just so, he hated himself so much for that. And then, like, all that, like, toxic masculinity from his father, like, he saw it, and I think it made him black out in, like, a rage.
Yeah.
Where it was like, it wasn't him and he couldn't control it, so he had to hurt someone else. And it was 2 grown men.
Literally, it's like, it's 2 grown men. Like, mind your business. Like, shield your eyes away and mind your business. But, of course, he didn't. Shield your eyes away and mind your business. But he doesn't, of course. And actually, like, when he's in prison, his miserable ass father actually ends up dying. And so he dies while he's in prison in, like, on Christmas of 1969. And his dad actually was reported to have cried during the sentencing. And I was like, well, you made that, so don't cry.
Right.
Like, you did that. Like, you took a part in making that creature the way he was.
You did that, Mama.
You did that,
this
Mama.
Is garbage.
Mama, you made that garbage. Now you gotta own up to it. Own up to the garbage.
Right.
Like, what was it Megan Thee Stallion who was, like, telling Cardi? She was like, you wanted these motherfucking snakes? You gonna get these motherfucking snakes. Like, that's literally what happened. I'm like, you created this fucking snake, and now you're, like, you're baffled. You're, like, crying at a sentencing.
You're like, what?
You're like, what?
What?
I didn't do that. And
he's literally that little kid that wakes up and is like, what?
What? The little girl who, like, whips her head around. She goes, what?
Right.
So his dad ends up dying. And, of course, like, John's so distraught, even though his dad was being shit. But that's fine. So then, after he is released, he actually ends up making his wonderful return to good old Chicago, which is where we're going to get into a lot of the shenanigans with him, because this whole time in Chicago is where we get all the murders happening and all the shenaniganry. Yes. So he is released after only a mere baby amount of time of 18 months for, molesting these teenagers, but I guess it's fine. And so he returns to Chicago and he's living with his mother. And in 1971, he assaults another teenager, but of course these charges get dropped. I think probably because this kid was intimidated and he didn't show up to the trial. Or, like, he didn't show up for, like, charges or everything.
Right, which is what happens with a lot of people.
Yeah, especially male victims.
Right. Because it's the 70s. And you don't, number one, don't want to tell people that happened. Number two, especially if you're a young man.
Yep.
Or, a boy and that's happening to you.
So in 1972, he gets charged with impersonating a police officer so that he can lure a teenage boy and force him to perform oral sex. These charges also get dropped. But the problem with this, which I'm sure you can imagine, is that he got off on parole from Iowa. He gets off on parole, okay?
After 16 to 18 months.
After a mere 16 to 18 payments of $19.95, he gets released. And so he returns to Chicago. He's just one assault after the other is happening. And none of this information is going back to his parole board in Iowa because there's no communication between states at this point as of yet.
Right.
So
I hate that. That's like with all these serial killers and all these murders, and like nothing gets done because one state won't share the information with the other state because everyone wants to be the winner.
It's just like everyone's just like having a pissing contest. Not how it works. And it's just like, in the meantime, this man ends up killing 33 people when he could have been in prison.
That's why every time I watch Zodiac, I fucking lose my mind because of how fast things could have been solved if, like, even the different fucking counties got their shit together inside this one state.
Just talk to one another. Please, God.
Yes.
So at the time, no one is talking
to
each other.
Come on, people now. Talk to each other. Let's solve the murders.
Okay. All right.
And love one another. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. So... Thank you so much for that.
Yes.
So those charges get dropped. because no one's saying anything. So he's now assaulted 2 people and nothing has been said. It's also worth mentioning that, of course, his wife, Marilyn, divorces him. And, like, he never sees his kids again. He's like, goodbye.
This shit empty.
Yeet. And she, like,
and then she throws him out the window.
Yeah, she gets the fuck out of there.
Right.
And so his wife, Marilyn, just ends up absolutely being like, you know what, I'm so sorry. I've got to get the fuck out of here. So she's
like, I'm good.
I'm good. I'm great. Goodbye. So she ends up leaving him while he's, like, in prison. She's like, I'm so sorry. I've got to go. So at this point, he's returning to Chicago alone. And this is when these assaults happen. And then in 1972, he actually ends up getting married to Kathy Hull. And this is when he moves into the legendary house on 8213 Somerdale Avenue. So this is a big year for John. This is when he actually ends up getting married to Carol Huff, they are the ones who move into the legendary house on 8213 Somerdale Avenue.
Yes, and she has 2 daughters, correct?
Yes, she has 2 daughters who become his stepchildren.
Right, and she's a single mom, like, she's on welfare, like, and she sees this guy who's, like, you know, he's not the most attractive or anything, but he's charismatic, and he has money, and he has a house. Mm-hmm. So it's, like, a mother with her 2 daughters moving in, and, like, he was very good with children and kids, especially her daughters, and even her daughter started calling him dad right away, basically. So it was... It wasn't weird for her. They were just a very close family unit right away. Yeah,
and 2, the thing with this is that he's, like, the kind of person who just kind of reels in people very quickly. He's very, like, he's magnetic. Like, people are like, oh, my God. So it's just, like, this big, apparently jolly guy, like, on the surface is what you see. So, of course, you're like, oh, okay, like, this is a chance at stability, because he had been working as a cook when he got out of prison, and then he works his way up to starting a contracting business called PDM Contractors, which is, like, the personal microdermabrasion device. No, I'm just kidding.
No.
He starts a business full of personal microdermabrasion.
I thought you were actually going to be serious about that, and then I heard, and I was like, oh, never mind.
He starts a whole business of personal microdermabrasion devices that I buy for the low price of 3 payments of $39.99. He doesn't.
If we say that one more time, I'm going to lose my shit.
Call us. We're standing by. So
yes.
It actually stands for Painting, Decorating, and Maintenance. So he starts this contracting business called PDM. Yes. And he also sells personal microdermabrasion of a device on the side.
He does not sell that. Stop lying to the good people who listen to this podcast. The very few we have.
The very few of you who listen. Okay, so he is generally known as this basically just like pillar of the community. So if you guys don't know, he lives in what is now known as like Norridge. But I think then Desplaines, Norridge, or like Norwood Park. So he lives literally minutes away from us. And friend of the show actually lives 4 blocks away from this house, where this house is.
I actually went there today because on our way back home, it's literally on the path to our way back home. And just passing it is just so... Because obviously, like, the address has changed and everything. But just to think about, like, what happened there and how close to home it is just gives you, like, a chill. It's just very, very ominous.
It's just creepy. To think about. Even looking at, like, so you sent me, like, videos and pictures of everything. And it's just creepy to think about the fact that, like, where that house is, there was literally bodies right where that front door is. There's literally bodies all throughout what that house is built on. So it's everywhere. Just and can you imagine terrifying.
The people living there?
Yeah.
Like, I couldn't do it. I mean, it's for sale right now, and I texted Danielle, and I was like, let's buy it. Let's put our $5 together each, and
our 2 pence that we can rub together. We'll just live in this Gacy house.
Yes. Just be squatters in the Gacy house. No, absolutely. But, like, just, like, even if it's, like, oh, like, you know, like, there's not ghosts there, or, like, you know, whatever. Either way, just, like, the energy and the presence that place had to have with the horrific things that happened there. Ugh.
It's just terrible. It's just it's just horrifying. And even though, like, the original house has been knocked down, but it's still the land. And the land in this case...
Because the lot was there for a while. Yes. It was just the lot. And then they built the new house in, like, 82, I think.
Mm-hmm. Which we'll get into that later.
82 or, like, 86. Between those dates, there was construction going on, I believe.
Because we're going to be talking more about that later, kind of what happens with the house and everything. But it's just so weird to think about that, like, literally minutes away from us, there is this house where just like literal evil went down. You know what I mean? And it's just so weird because I can't imagine just living on top of that. It's kind of like the house, the Manson house or Sharon Tate's house. The guy who owns it now, because I was telling Gina, I was like, the guy who owns it now, it's so creepy because he said like that house, the original house was knocked down and they rebuilt things and everything, but they still have an original piece of the floor. Like they still have like an original piece of like whatever. And so that just captures energy. That doesn't go away. So like I can't imagine living in a space with that much like horrific energy just happening. You know what I mean? It's so creepy to me, and it's so just like, oh my God, like legendary evil went down at this place, and there were bodies underneath where you're standing right now. You know, and it's not just like, oh, he buried them in the backyard.
And even if it's taken out, even if the bodies are taken out, it doesn't matter.
No, it doesn't.
That doesn't go away.
It doesn't go away. That, like, just such horrible bad things happened on that ground underneath that house. Like, it's not like it's just like in the backyard or here or there, like whatever the case may be. They were underneath where that house is right now, and that was their final almost like their final resting place for years. You know what I mean? So but it's just like eerie to look at that house. It's just so like, oh my God, it's just horrible. It's like just not a good feeling.
No, it's not even like parking, because like we didn't get out of the car or anything, but just like sitting there and looking at it, I was telling Danielle, it's like this deep like feeling in your chest where it was just like heaviness and sadness, and you feel your body just kind of like, I don't know, go into like defense mode because it's just so heartbreaking and tragic. But this is where it just starts to get so bad, and these are where all these victims are buried.
8213 is just like this place of absolute just evil. So that's like kind of where the story is going to start. This is definitely
It's so funny how
crazy
addresses have that, you know, like 112 Ocean Avenue, or, you know, like all the famous addresses.
What is 112 Ocean Avenue?
Amityville.
Oh, okay. I don't know.
Yes.
I don't know why. I don't know why. I thought you were referencing famous Yellow Card song like Ocean Avenue.
Yep.
I was like,
was that song written about Amityville?
I don't know.
I don't listen to Yellow Card. I don't know.
I was like, are you referencing like 2003? I don't know if it's 2003, but are you referencing like early 2000s song Ocean Avenue by Yellow Card?
Yes, I was.
Okay, sorry.
It's exactly. Anyway.
So these famous addresses just become kind of just like immortalized as these places of just like absolute crazy evil. Like, and now we even seen that with the case of the Emmons family haunting. Like, that's another one now that became just absolute, just like crazy evil.
Or the family in France on Unsolved Mysteries.
Yes. Like these places.
That's another house of horrors.
Just become absolute, like, because even now, like, even though the addresses changed and everything, you still are like, wow, you could just drive past this place. You could be interacting with that energy. You know what I mean?
It exists in our time.
In our
still.
time, yeah.
Yeah.
And it's so different when you have murders from the 70s or you have murders from, like, 90s, whatever, where it's like, okay, this is not, like, happening in the 1800s. Like, you can go to Madame LaLaurie's house and feel kind of a degree of removal from it. But this is literally just like our parents were alive when this was happening. We know people who we know people who have been murdered by this person. And we also know people who have almost been abducted by this person. So it's just like crazy to think about the fact that literally blocks away from us, legendary evil goes down and nobody knew about it for so long.
I mean, that was when I used to live back home by Danielle, where it was like blocks from me. There's legendary evil, which is just Danielle's house.
It was. Absolutely. It still is. So this is where our stories.
Danielle would like go to answer her. I'd like knock on her door and be like, "I'm here," and she'd be like, "There's legendary evil, literally 2 feet from me." What do I do?
Ricky Tikki Tavi? What did you say?
Yes, I said legendary evil, Ricky Tikki Tavi. No, you idiot. I said when I would call you.
That's true.
And you would answer your door. There's legendary evil 2 feet from me.
I mean, you're not wrong. It was just my nephews.
Fucking Ricky Tikki Tavi.
I was like, why are we discussing famous legendary snake, Ricky Tikki Tavi?
Ricky Tikki Tavi wasn't a snake. He was the mongoose.
Oh my God, shut up. Oh my God. That mongoose was a snake in his own right. Anyway.
Okay.
So, like we were talking about, he's selling personal microdermabrasion devices with his contracting company, PDM.
Yes.
So he becomes like this pillar of the community. So this is where he's living, it's a very tight-knit, kind of upper middle class neighborhood. So it's just very tight-knit. Everyone's on top of each other kind of deal. Everyone's really involved with each other. It's still kind of like that to a certain degree today.
It's still like that. No one still can mind their own business.
Yeah, everyone's just in everyone's business. And so he's generally known as this like pillar of the community. Like several people are just like, oh my God, he is this normal guy. Everyone loved him. And he was just like, nobody thought anything of it. And so he had this business. He's throws block parties. He goes to church. He's very loved. And he also, this is where we get legendary Pogo the Clown, because he becomes part of something called like, I think it was called like a Moose Club. Moose Club?
Yes.
And they volunteer, and he starts going to children's hospitals and parties as Pogo the Clown. So
I wonder if that was involved with Moose Lodge.
Might have been. He was a Mason. Absolutely confirmed.
Yeah.
There's a Masonic temple
100%.
in our town, Gina.
I know.
I didn't know that until like I was going by on the bus.
It's my house.
Get the fuck out. Oh my God.
I don't even live there anymore.
Anyway, Gina actually lived at a Masonic temple.
I do.
Anyway, so he would be doing like visits as Pogo the Clown. He was in politics. He was part of the Jaycees, which I kind of am like not even into explaining anything about them.
Gacy on the Jaycees.
Gacy on the Jaycee. Just like they were like an organization and all this stuff, which we're like trying not to go heavy on his whole life because nobody cares about him anyway.
Right.
So he
fucking boring.
Yeah, fucking dumb. So he absolutely is like, everyone's like, he's amazing, he's wonderful. He becomes active in the Democratic Party, and he begins to volunteer on campaigns, which only makes him more loved in the community. So he's just like, everyone's just like, this man, he's so amazing, wonderful. And so that's the face that he's showing to this entire community that everyone else is seeing. And before we get to the killings, I think it's worthy to mention that Gacy himself actually claimed that there was an alternate personality that would take hold of him, called the other guy.
Yes.
He would just play...
And even as Pogo. Because when he put on, like, the lipstick and the Pogo makeup, he could be...
When he put on Max Ruby Woo, he became a new person. A new woman.
That's not... It's not what it was.
It's canon.
But he would kind of be... Woo. I hate everything about this. But no, he would become, like, Pogo the Clown almost, because he didn't have to be himself. Yeah. He didn't have to be this, like, polished family man. Yeah. He could, like, do whatever he wants. Basically.
Yeah. So he just claimed that this alternate personality, which, like, we see with, I think it's Ted Bundy saying the entity, or this person, or, like, even with the...
Son of Sam.
Or the Hillside Stranglers, how they are kind of just like, oh, yeah, this other... I think, what did he call him? Like, Steve?
You mean Mario and Luigi?
And Mario and Luigi. When Mario and Luigi, like, got down to it, they were just garbage, and they literally were like... oh, it was this other person took over my body, blah, blah. It's like, no, you did that, but it's fine.
Wasn't that kind of Dahmer, too? But Dahmer was just, like, heavily drunk. So that was just an alter personality in itself.
Yeah. And so he would claim that this alternate personality would basically take a hold of him, called the other guy, and that was who actually carried out the killing. So, like, he separates John from the other guy who actually did all these murders. I should just say that
when I ordered $25 worth of Taco Bell.
Like, ma'am, is this all for you?
And then, like... when people are like, Gina, like, why don't you have any money? Like, why did you order $25 worth of Taco Bell? And I'm like, oh, that wasn't me. That was the other guy. The other guy took over. And ordered 5 quesadillas. Yeah. And a Crunchwrap Supreme. Yeah.
Like, oh, no, I don't know her. I never met her. I'm so sorry.
I don't know her.
I don't know her anymore. So.
Anyway.
Okay. So, this is what we're going to be getting into the victims. But before we say any of that, I think... we're not going to be... sometimes we'll be going in depth for some of these killings, and sometimes we won't, because I don't think it's worth it to hear the same thing 20 different times. I think it's kind of traumatizing to hear it. But, so before we say anything, we're just going to go over the fact that his general method of murder was either suffocation or strangulation for essentially almost all but one of these victims. And he would take a rope and twist it using a piece of wood until they slowly choked to death. Or he would use a rag or their own underwear and shove it down their throat and basically make them vomit until they choked to death, essentially.
Yes.
And so that's means of murder in this case. Like his general MO was to strangle them or to suffocate them. So that's generally what happened in almost all of these killings. So I'm not going to be repeating it over and over of like what he did. So we're going to get into our first murder, which is the murder of Timothy Jack McCoy, who was only 16 years old at the time.
Yes. And one of my friends who went to Loyola University, and she had a crim professor who actually worked on the missing persons case for Tim McCoy. Yeah. And it's just like, but at the time they didn't know who it was because they hadn't identified the body yet until his remains were found.
Yeah.
But this is the boy at the Greyhound bus station, right?
Yes. So he is from Council Bluffs, Iowa, and he had been visiting his aunt in Michigan and was on his way back. And so actually Gacy ended up picking him up from the Greyhound bus station in the Loop, in which you can basically...
Where I've been and filmed an episode of Shameless.
Yeah. Literally. So from where Gacy lives, you can literally hop right on the expressway and you can go straight downtown really easily. Because like where he lives, you literally go right there.
Right on the 94.
Yeah, you go right there and you can go straight downtown. So he had very easy access to downtown. So he would basically just go drive in his car, go up there. So he picks up Tim.
He put on Paramore. He was like, I'm driving fast in my car.
I got my right, get on, and I just want to
Haley Williams is going to sue us.
I hope she does. Good. She should. That was horrible. Anyway, he's got his pogo suit on, and he just wants to have fun. Anyway.
Right. He was like, ain't it fun?
Oh, my God.
Killing in the real world.
Oh my God, we're going to hell. Anyway.
I'm so sorry, everyone. I'm so sorry. I'm not sorry.
Like,
I'm just kidding. That was really funny.
How Henry says, I'm sorry to everyone. He's like, I just want to do a blanket apology. I'm sorry to everyone. That's kind of how I
should
feel.
do that at the beginning of every episode from now on, a blanket apology. Anyway, so he drives downtown. He's driving fast in his car. He goes to the Loop.
Yeah, he goes to the Loop. This is where he picks up Jack and takes him back to his house, where he essentially he picks up Jack and is like, hey, like, do you want to come stay, Timothy Jack McCoy. So he picks up Tim, and he basically is like, hey, I'll pick you up so you don't have to, like, stay here the night, and then I'll just drive you back to the Greyhound bus station in the morning. And so...
And this was on New Year's Eve, right?
I think, yeah, because
it was, like, right after New Year's.
Yeah.
Because he was at a New Year's party with his wife, with, like, friends.
Yes.
And he left the New Year's party because he got bored and went to go pick up this boy at the bus station instead of being at the party. And since his wife just, like, stayed there because, like, they had been drinking, so she just stayed the night at the friend's house instead of going back home the next day.
So she literally, like, that happens, he leaves, goes downtown, finds this kid, and this kid comes to his house, where it's let...
Well, because they had sex.
Yeah,
because it was kind of like a pickup, you know, because, like, people, like, men, like, if they were gay and didn't want to be known, like, just drive around and, like, pick people up. So he picked people up that, because he was such a pillar of the community, he didn't want to just pick up anyone.
You can't go so that's why where he was living, he could not just hunt for victims, kind of where he was. I mean, he does later on,
that's why he got this out-of-towner.
Yeah.
Because he was like, oh, this is fine, and, like, no one's going to know about it.
No one's going to ever know. So he picks up Timothy, and they go back to his house, engage in oral sex, and they start to drink, and then Timothy falls asleep on his couch. So this is where the infamous story of his first murder comes from, is when Gacy basically claimed that early in the morning, Tim comes up with a knife in hand, and so he reacted in self-defense. He sees Tim, and Tim wakes him up basically with a knife in hand. Mm-hmm. And so he reacted in self-defense. They struggle before he stabs Timothy 4 times in the chest and in the stomach. And when Gacy goes downstairs... He goes back downstairs after this happens. He leaves Tim upstairs on the floor. He goes down to the kitchen, and he sees bacon on the counter that hasn't been cut yet. And he realizes... So
he was making breakfast for him.
He realizes that Tim
was going to make it. Yeah.
So he realizes that Tim has been trying to just make him breakfast and probably came upstairs to be like, hey, I'm making breakfast, like, wake up.
Right.
So he realizes this, and then he says, like, he kind of heard, like, a gurgling sound from Tim, and he goes back upstairs and realizes that Timothy's dead. which is...
Oh, he just realizes he's dead after he stabbed him 4
times.
times. Don't you hate when that happens, when you stab someone 4 times and you're like, oh no, wait, you're
shit,
dead?
You're dead when you tried doing something nice for me. Oh my god. Right. So this is actually the first body to go in Gacy's legendary crawl space, which is where 29 bodies are going to be found. And so his body ends up being buried once he's discovered. His body ends up being buried anonymously in Chicago until 1986, when Timothy was identified via dental records by an orthodontist who was going to be important throughout all these cases because he was part of the team who helped identify most of the dental records for all of the victims for the Gacy, from the Gacy crawl space. So when they found the body under the crawl space, he wasn't identified until 1986. So this orthodontist named Dr. Edward Pavlik, he's the one who helps identify him because Timothy had really unique dental fillings, and he had certain unique teeth that basically helped him to make this identification. And he also had a belt buckle with a Model T Ford on it, so that helps him identify his body. So
wow, okay.
Yeah, and so his body was eventually, like in 1986, his body was finally returned to his family to be properly buried. But all of these victims kind of just get anonymously buried in Chicago until they're discovered. I think what they generally put on the tombstones is like, "We remember," I think is what it is.
So they just had like a mass grave type of thing? Not like a mass grave, but like, I think that's just like an area.
Yeah, I think
did the families know?
Well, okay, but when they started making identifications, like they did certain identifications were made like right then, okay, or like whatever.
Right.
But then some of them
longer.
took years, and so until they were actually identified, I think some of them, or like if they couldn't be identified after a certain amount of time, they would just bury them. For the unknown victims, their grave just says "We remember," and it will say like their estimated date of death. Or we remembered, and it would say like just they estimated they died June this, whatever. And so that's generally what would happen to the body if it wasn't identified within like a few years. So he was one of those who later gets identified because of that. And so about this murder, John basically said like he experienced this really intense orgasm when he killed Tim, and so in this 1980 interview, he said, "That's when I realized that death was the ultimate thrill." Yeah,
and that's where you can't go back. This is your point where you're like, "Well, this is it," and nothing else is gonna quench that thirst.
Switch kind of got flipped
except
for him,
killing people,
and it was just like sexual thrill that goes along with murder. It was kind of just like, this is just the beginning of the end. Do you know what I mean? Nothing's gonna help him.
Nothing else is gonna do it for me at this point.
So our second victim is actually unidentified, and so his estimated age was 14 to 18 years old. And so they estimate that he disappeared between 1972 and 1975. Gacy claimed that it was 1974. So when this first story started off, we have 1972. It's 1972. And so Gacy says 1974 is when this 14 to 18-year-old goes missing. He said he strangled the victim and put him in his closet before he buried him. Fluid started to leak from the body, so he put the victim's underwear in his mouth so it wouldn't leak after he realized that it was staining his carpet.
Jesus.
And he does this with other victims too before he buries them.
And his wife and stepchildren are in this house too.
Yes.
Still. Yes. Correct? Yeah.
And so he actually ended up burying this victim by the barbecue pit. But he's unidentified as of right now.
You know, you got to have the open pit, and then you got to have your victim next to it just to get that real good...
Just that real good flavor.
That good technique. Right.
So now we're going to move to July of 1975, when Anthony Antonucci gets assaulted by Gacy when he was only 15 years old. Gacy showed up at his house when he was alone, and he cuffs and wrestles Anthony to the floor. And Anthony actually had a foot injury at this time, so he kind of couldn't defend himself, but he managed to actually get his arm out of the cuff, and he wrestles Gacy to the floor after he comes back. Like, Gacy leaves him tied up. He comes back into the room, and he wrestles Gacy to the floor. He was actually a high school wrestler.
Yes.
And so he eventually... Like, Gacy's like, okay, like, hey, I'll let you go and, like, leave.
Right.
But this case doesn't really get reported.
turns around to like, oh, I was kidding. Or like, I was
kidding.
I was just messing around.
Yeah. So it's just like, it's just so intense to think about. You know what I mean? Like, it's just like, all of this is all happening to 15-year-old boys. You know what I mean? It's just like, it's just terrible.
Right.
And so now our next victim we're going to move on to is John Butkovich. John
yeah.
Butkovich, who was 18 years old. And he actually ends up getting buried in Queen of Heaven, which is where we know several people.
Right. A lot of our family's buried there, and that is where the Our Lady of Angels fire.
Yeah.
That's where the Our Lady of Angels fire is.
So that's
not where the fire is, where the memorial is for the Our Lady of Angels fire victims at Queen of Heaven.
Yeah. So John ends up getting killed in July of 1975 is when John's murders is. And he was a Chicago native, and I think he was from Lombard.
Okay.
Which is like very close to us. All these boys go missing from is very close by.
Yes.
So he was actually an employee of John's because John has just been essentially employing a bunch of teenagers.
Mm-hmm.
And so he is employing all these teenagers, and they all just go work for him because he's giving them really good wages for the time. Yeah. Like, you're making a lot of money, so they'll go work for him.
Because you're a teenager, and you're like, oh, like, it's more money, and I get to hang out with this guy and drink, and, like, it's cool. He's giving me alcohol. Fine. Yeah.
Yeah. So he is one of John's employees who he goes missing after basically he has this dispute over a check. So he goes over to John's house to be like, hey, like, what the hell? Like, I want my paycheck. And so he actually, which this is, like, just terrible because he was really close with Gacy. So they used to call them Big John and Little John. And they were both really drunk so he was drunk before he went over to John's house to argue with him. And so the last thing that John Wayne Gacy recalls is putting John in cuffs, and then he wakes up to find that John has a rope around his neck and he's dead. Supposedly, allegedly.
Right.
He then gets buried in the crawl space, and he is the first body to actually be found. And the police actually end up following up with John Wayne Gacy about this case. And John Wayne Gacy just lies to them and is like, yeah, he told me he was going to, like, go, like, run away with the money or something, you know?
Yeah, because that still warrants you ending a child's life.
Yeah, well, he was basically just saying, like, the police follow up with him, and he's like, yeah, I don't know. Like, he just said he was going to go away with this money, like, no problem, you know what I mean?
Right.
And so the police kind of don't look into this any further. But John's parents also, like, they really believe that this was Gacy, and they always believed it. And so they would actually, like, they ended up calling the police up to, like, 100 times to be like, you need to investigate John Wayne Gacy. But, like, nothing ended up ever actually coming of it.
Right.
So in 1975, this is when John actually ends up coming out to his wife as being bisexual.
Mm-hmm.
And so he basically just tells his wife that they're no longer going to have sex anymore. Like, that part of their relationship is over. And his wife, which,
she was kind of, like, supportive of it. Not, like, supportive of it, but she was, like, okay with him being bisexual.
Yeah, she was okay with it, but also his wife witnesses him taking boys into the basement.
Right, and it's
like, his wife's seen that.
Carol, come on.
You have to know that, like, something is happening. Your husband should never be taking underage men into the house. Okay? Yeah. Like, that should not be something that you're just okay with, and it's fine. You know what I mean?
Not to blame Carol, you know, but at the same time, like, look out for your surroundings. Be aware.
Yeah.
See something, say something, you know?
Yeah, yeah. And he also restricted her from going into, like, certain areas of the house. Like, you can't go in the basement. Right. You can't do this.
Can't go in my basement. Or, like, later in the garage when it's like, oh, don't go in the garage. And she goes in and there's, like, a red light and, like, a mattress on the floor and, like, all this other shit. And she's like, oh, this is normal. This is fine.
Which, like, from her perspective, I get it. Maybe you're like, oh, he's just having sex with people and he doesn't want me to know. But I think to a certain degree, she probably knew in the back of her head that something was happening.
Well, and also they're the couple that would have, like, swingers parties, right?
Yeah, I think so.
They would have, like, orgies and swingers parties and all this shit. So maybe she was just, like, a freak, and she was, like, certified freak 7 days a week. This is fine. I don't care. Whatever. I'm not going to ask.
That's what she said. Certified freak 7 days a week. Yep. I don't care.
Yep.
So so they end up actually getting divorced by October of 1975. And then in February of 1976, he basically has the house all to himself.
Right, now he's free to do whatever the fuck he wants.
Yeah, and so he basically started just lying and saying that, or they ended up lying for the divorce, and they basically just said that he was being unfaithful with women, not men.
Mm-hmm.
So by February of 1976, he is like home free. He can do whatever the fuck he wants, okay? So this is like, I was watching the interviews with his sister Karen, and she said she would go, okay, sorry. So I was watching interviews with his sister Karen, and so she said, quote, when he and his second wife moved in, there was always this kind of musty smell, she says. In later years, he kept saying that there was water standing under the house and he was treating it with lime, and that's what the mold smell was. So it was actually just, there was bodies under his house, and that was what was going on. Right. That was what's happening, Karen, okay? It was not just this mold smell. So his house actively smells, and he had people in his house.
Right, and they're like having parties, and they're like, man, like, we need some Febreze, like something. Like,
can someone just like light a match?
If your house smells like ass.
Mm-hmm.
Can't do it. Should be a rule.
Wise words for John Wayne Gacy. You can't host if your house smells like ass.
It's true.
So it's February of 1976, and so he is home free. He's like, great, wonderful. So this is when they believe that the fourth victim was killed, which is between January 1976 and March of 1977. He was a 22 to 32-year-old male, and he still remains unidentified. So our fifth victim is Daryl Julius Sampson, and he was 19 years old, and he disappears on April 6th of 1976. And so this was a quote from his mom. She said, "Here in Chicago, I found myself walking the streets at night looking for him. I wore blisters on the bottom of my feet. I burned up 4 cars trying to find him." And that was his mother, Dolores. She reported him missing, and the police said that he was basically just a runaway.
Yeah, that was like all these guys. It was like, oh, it's not a big deal. Yeah.
And so this kind of...
Which, great fucking police work with the Chicago Police Department there. Real good one, guys.
Well, especially during this time, this was like the Des Plaines police. Like, this is small town police. Mm-hmm. Which, like, listen, I have nothing against police, but I have something against shitty police work. Yeah, like, they're all, like, all these police departments have to know, like, something's going on.
I have something against police. I have something against all of them, especially police in the fucking 70s.
Well, I'm just saying, but not in general. Right. I'm not saying, like, oh, all police are garbage. But I'm saying these police did terrible, shitty police work and let a lot of things slide when they shouldn't have.
Right. Also, in the 70s, all of them were garbage anyways.
Yeah, all of them were just garbage.
No one could do their job.
Because some of these victims were alleged to be sex workers. So, of course, that adds another layer to this. Like, or if they were gay or a sex worker, it was just like, oh, okay, whatever. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, but that's as most I'm going to say about it. I'm not going to identify people as, like, sex worker or not. Every person in this case deserved a full investigation of their case, no matter what they did.
Yes.
So, Daryl Julius Sampson, he was 19, and so she reported him missing. They said he ran away. And he had actually gone over to John's house to discuss a job. Like, that's what he went, to be like, oh, hey, I want this job. But his body was actually found underneath the dining room floorboards and was identified between 1979 and 1980.
Jeez. And so at this time, is this when David Cram is also working for him?
This is all, we're going to get into David Cram.
Okay.
A little bit later. But, we'll get into David Cram, don't you worry.
We'll get into David Cram.
We'll get into David Cram. So our sixth victim is Samuel Stapleton, and he was only 14 years old, and he is one of the youngest victims of John Wayne Gacy. He goes missing on his way home from his sister's house. He was identified due to a bracelet being found on his body in the crawl space, and he went missing on May 13th of 1976, and he was also identified by the outline of his teeth. So that's Samuel, and Samuel was literally only 14. Mm. So our seventh victim is Randall Ruffett, and he was only 15 years old, and he was buried at Rose Hill.
Yes.
And so he disappeared May 14th of 1976, and he was asphyxiated after being gagged with some cloth, and he is found under the front door. Which I think this is why, looking at that house, this case was very hard for me. This case was very hard for me to research, and I'm like, after doing this, I'm like, I need to take 4 baths and drown in bleach. Because, like, looking at that house, I don't know if I could ever live in a house like that, because looking at that house, you realize that, like, there's a 15-year-old who was buried just under where that front door was. Like, it's just so horrific to imagine. And so I think that for this case, like, reading about 14-year-olds and 15-year-olds is just like, they're babies.
Yeah.
This is a baby who got just his whole life stolen by a fucking monster. You know what I mean? And that's why I don't think I can partake in this kind of, like, legendary status that John Wayne Gacy gets, where it's just like killer, clown, so scary, blah, like, it's a joke. You know what I mean?
Right.
I can't really partake in that narrative anymore, because I'm just like, after reading about, because we don't hear this. Most of the time when podcasts cover this, or when this is covered in videos, we're not running through all these murders. Like, we're not running through the fact that most of these kids were 14 years old.
Right.
You know what I mean? So, like, that's not a narrative that we're hearing. But, like, hearing these cases and, like, going in depth into the fact of, like, this kid is just walking home from his sister's house and he gets murdered, like, by a fucking absolute monster.
Right.
So, yeah, this case was very hard for me. It really sucked, but I'm glad that we covered it. I'm glad I got the perspective and get to tell these kids stories, because I think they really are stories that deserve to be told.
Yes.
But, and you've actually just visited some of these people's graves, which I think we want to, like, also visit some of their graves and kind of pay homage to them, because they are close to us.
Pay respect. Yeah, I won't mention the name of the cemetery or anything, but my grandfather is buried in Des Plaines, and I went to go visit him today, and brought some white carnations with me, and went to go visit my grandpa, and I've mentioned this before, but a few feet away from where my grandpa is buried is the last victim of Gacy, who is Robert Peast. And I just really wanted to go and just pay my respects before we even started this episode, and I left a flower for him. And, just kind of, mentioned, I was like, hey, I'm really sorry that this horrific thing happened to you, but, I want you to know that you're remembered, and that piece of shit is dead, and he's at peace anyways. So, like, it's just when, just, like, sitting there and just, like, thinking about it and being like, hey, just letting you know, like, you're not forgotten, and what happened wasn't in vain. So, it's just, like, he's just a little baby. You know what I mean? It's just so
they're 14 or 15. Even, like, his oldest victim is, like, 22, or, like, or, like, even one who could have been 32 years old. Like, they still had a life to live. They were still loved by somebody. And I think that's what this case has kind of granted, like, both of us in that regard, of, like, a sense of reverence for the fact that, like, this is more than just something to cover in the podcast. You know what I mean? It's kind of, it just adds a sense of gravity to the situation that I don't think I had before. And so I think as much as hard as this case was to cover, I think it's also something that was really important for us to cover, because I don't think that a lot of people talk about
and
this.
it's a big part of our lives too.
Yeah.
Even like personally, or even just like not in the personal aspects, like, it's a part of where we grew up. It's a part of our family stories.
Yeah.
Stories with, like, friends, just like it. I think it's just cool that we get to talk about it and we get to cover it, being from here, because I don't think you get a lot of that personal touch when other podcasts cover it, which is great. Like, people do, like, a great job, like, great around
like,
research.
No shade.
Right.
It's not to be
I
like,
just listened to the last podcast on the left episode, and they did a really good job. Like, they went into like great depth. My Favorite Murder, like any other podcast, like, covering it. But it's just different when it's personally affected you, and you grew up with these stories,
Which a lot of, like, shout out to Last Book on the Left by Last Podcast on the Left. Like, that book was a lot of, like, it influenced a lot of the research that I did. It helped me along with the story and understand the story. So, like, no shade to any other podcast that covers it or whatever. But I think being from Chicago, it kind of just felt a little bit different than other stories that we've covered. It's kind of like with the case of, what's his name? The guy who killed all the nurses?
Oh, Richard Speck.
With respect, like, when you go to that place in the Chicago, like, haunting tour, or when you do all of that, it feels a little bit different, because you're here. This is your hometown. This happened somewhere you live. And, like, for us, it's literally minutes away from our hometown. We have people who live in the same town that he lived in. Right. So I think it's a little bit different. It's really weird.
Yes.
And getting back into it. Oh, sorry.
Oh, no, no,
Go
no,
ahead.
no. You're saying, I was just saying, like, when we talk about, like, our personal stories and connections, like, you'll see how, like, close in quarters it can be. Like,
Yeah.
just like, really getting into that. But, yes, continue.
So we're going to be going into the murder of Michael Bonin.
Okay.
I think it's Bonin. Think that was the thing. Um. So Michael was from Lakeview, and he was traveling from Chicago to Waukegan, which is probably about an hour, well, like an hour away from each other, an hour and a half away from each other. And so Gacy ended up luring him in, and he
Yeah.
offered him drugs and beer at his house, and he ended up,
Because Gacy would drive around, like, Lincoln Park,
yeah,
Lakeview, right,
yeah.
too? And look for guys? Yeah.
So he essentially,
Which is where I live right now, which is really, I live in Lakeview right now, and it's just also weird to think about. But anyway, sorry
well,
for
no, that's like
interrupting.
the thing is like he would go downtown and he would just basically drive around looking for victims and kind of trying to lure people into his car with drugs or beer or whatever, or like sex or whatever the case it was. But Michael
Right.
Bonin was from Lakeview and he was 17 years old. Gacy lures him in with the offer of drugs and beer, and then he ends up strangling him. And Michael was actually identified via fishing license that was found. So Gacy ends up keeping objects from these people. And they're kind of like his
Yes.
house just becomes this treasure trove because it ends up that like he has like Michael's fishing license is inside his house. And so in 1979, they end up finding his fishing license, and that helps to identify that he's one of the bodies.
Right.
So then our ninth victim is William Carroll, who was 16 years old. Um, so he is identified as being the kind of kid who was known for kind of getting into trouble. He goes
Mm-hmm.
missing on June 13th of 1976, and he basically just told his dad, like, hey, I'll be back in an hour. He gets into a dark car with three of his friends, and he's never heard from again. He gets identified in March of 1979 by his dental records. But William Carroll is kind of interesting because, like, he's like this troublesome kid, but he's only 16. Like, kids are known for getting into
Yeah.
trouble. You know, he probably was going out, like, maybe him and his three friends got into the car with Gacy, and he's the one that went back to the house, is kind of what I think.
Yeah.
But yeah, his body gets found March of 1979 and identified. So our 10th victim is unknown. He goes missing between June of 1976 and August of 1976, and he was 22 to 30 years old.
Okay.
So now we're going to get into David Cram. So in July of 1976, he starts to work for Gacy when he's 18 years old. He moves in with Gacy in mid-August. So mind you, like, Gacy's alone at this time. He has his full
Yeah.
house to himself. His kids from his first marriage and his stepdaughters are both, like, kind of non-issues at this point.
Yeah.
Gacy, I don't think, ever seen his kids again after that. His biological children, I don't think he ever seen them.
Right.
And so he's, like, home free. So he manages to get cuffs on David. And he, while they're drunk,
And also,
he
you
gets
said David was 16?
18.
18. So he has an 18-year-old boy just living with him.
Who works for him,
It
mind
works
you.
for him, but he's basically also kind of like living at the house because he was there so often.
Yeah.
And just like has him over, and then you said is able to get handcuffs on him.
Yeah. So they get drunk. Gacy manages to get him in cuffs while he was dressed in full pogo costume. So he has his
Yes.
Mac Ruby Woo on. He's looking incredible. He's in full
He
pogo.
wasn't. And
Okay.
it said that he's kind of like now this like alter ego comes out where he's like
Yes.
Pogo the clown and he's like laughing and poking him and like does this hurt? Does this hurt?
Mm-hmm.
And he's like laughing maniacally as he like has this 18-year-old handcuffed.
And then he basically like picks David up. He swings him around. So he's just like whoosh, swings him around, and then David ends up kicking Gacy in the face after he realizes that Gacy is trying to rape him, and he ends up getting away.
Yes.
And this just kind of was like, yeah, okay, great. And then they move on.
And then
from
he
it.
goes back to working for him.
Yeah, he still works for him, and I think he was still living there to a degree because
Yeah.
then the next month Gacy attempts to rape him again, but Cram gets away again.
He just doesn't say anything and just
He
continues
just doesn't
on.
say anything, and it's like whatever. And after this, I think like he ended up like getting the fuck away from him. But
Right.
David Cram is one of the possible accomplices because he helped to dig trenches for Gacy.
Mm-hmm.
And so
But didn't Gacy tell him it was just like plumbing, like for plumbing
Gacy
purposes?
there's a few people who ended up digging trenches for Gacy, and the claim was that this was just for plumbing. That like something had gone out, like I'm digging these holes for a plumbing system or like whatever, that's what he told them. But there's also like it's also alleged that he might have actually helped to be a lure for boys and given them
Kinda
to
like,
John in exchange for rent.
Dean
Like
Coral, right?
Yeah, so it's kind of,
Yeah.
he might have been, there are several boys who might have been working for Gacy and bringing him boys in exchange for like drugs or alcohol or money or whatever the case might have been. Might have also been like a Dean Coral case of like, what is his name, Henley?
Mm-hmm.
He used to lure in boys for Dean Coral. So this might have also been just like that of like, you can stay here or I'll pay for your liquor, I'll pay for this.
Right.
If you just
And you don't think
boys.
like, oh, he's going to kill them. He's like, you know, that's his thing. That's none of my business. As long as I'm getting what I want, it doesn't matter.
Exactly. So our 11th victim was actually the most recently identified victim, who is Jimmy Hawkinson.
Hackinson.
Jimmy Hackinson, who was 16 years old. He goes missing on August 5th of 1976, and he was actually a runaway. He gives his sister a call on August 5th, and like that's the last time she heard from him. The mom files a missing report when he didn't come home. And 2 years later, when Gacy was arrested, the family actually became really curious and thought that like, oh, he was probably, maybe was he taken by Gacy? Is he a Gacy victim? But they kind of never were able to figure it out. But luckily for Jimmy, his nephew was really interested enough to look for his uncle 40 years later.
Yes, because wasn't it through 23andMe?
Like, yeah, he found him through like, a DNA site or something. Yeah, yes. He gave like a DNA. And so his sister said, oh yeah, I was overcome when that picture came out. I pretty much lost it because it really is true. My brother is dead. He's not coming home. He's in that grave. I often thought that he was just going to walk in the door and say, hi, sis, sorry I was gone for so long, but now I'm back. And that was from his sister Lori, who said that. So his nephew actually ends up going online. He gets in contact with a detective for the Gacy cold case, and they got the DNA tested, and it turned out to be a match. So he was actually identified in 2017.
Wow.
So he's the most recently identified Gacy victim.
It's amazing what they can do with DNA.
It's so cool. I love it. I was like, this is really, like, to think that, like, your brother has been gone for 40 years and then you get to find out what actually happened to him and, like, that he didn't just run away, like, completely. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So victims 12 and 13 are more unknowns. They are 17 to 21 years old for the first one and 21 to 27 for the second one, and they go missing around August of 1976.
Okay.
So the next victim we're going to talk about is Rick Johnston, who was 17 years old, and he was from Bensenville, which is about a half hour away from us. It's very
30, 40 minutes, depending on, my mom lives in Bensenville right now.
Yeah. So he ends up getting dropped off at a concert at the Aragon Ballroom, which is, you know, we've been there many a time.
We've been there many a time.
Gorgeous.
My Chemical Romance back in 2015.
Went to go see My Chemical Romance there. So on August 6th of 1976 is when he goes missing. He was probably going to see, like, I don't know, probably My Chemical Romance too.
Yes, exactly. Back in 1976.
1976. So our 15th victim is William George Bundy, who is 19. And so allegedly he actually worked for Gacy. And there's another theory that he was also an accomplice who helped him to dispose of bodies. So in October of 1976, he goes missing on his way to a party.
Okay.
So he forgot his wallet.
Is this in, like, the Chicago area? Or is it more, like, when he goes missing, like, is he from Chicago or is he from, like, Norridge, like that area?
He grew up on North Claremouth Avenue.
Okay.
I don't know where that is. But I think he's from Chicago. I think he's probably from around here. Okay. But I didn't really say. We'll figure it out. Anyway. So he was 19. We'll figure it out. So he forgets his wallet at home that night, and he was a gymnast, and a diver. And so he also was an electrician, so it's most likely that he worked with Gacy and maybe, like, was an accomplice of some sort.
Kind of the same thing as like David Cram, where it was like nothing like serious, but
yeah. So like he's alleged like maybe he helped him dispose of bodies, or he might have just helped him to dig the trenches, is what is like kind of thought.
Right.
But his family was always under the suspicion that he was murdered by Gacy. Like, he went missing in October of 1976, and they always thought, like, he might have been murdered by him because he had been working for him, and they kind of were like, what the hell happened, you know?
Yeah.
He forgets his wallet at home. He doesn't come back. So he was one of the unknowns, and he was actually buried at Resurrection Cemetery.
Okay.
And he was an unknown for a long time until a DNA match comes through, and he's identified in 2011.
Wow.
So he was, like, one of the more recent ones until we got Jimmy. So the last two victims that we're going to talk about are, like, you know, me and Gina. So this is Michael Marino, who was 14 years old. And so Michael and his friend, Kenneth Parker, who was 16 at the time, they disappeared near Clark and Diversey, which...
Literally where I live.
Yeah.
Literally blocks from where I live right now.
Yeah. So they disappear on Clark and Diversey. And
you know where that is? That's where the Target is now. Where Landmark Theater is. And,
God.
Stan's Donuts.
Oh my God, that's really creepy.
That's where that is.
That's really creepy. I don't like that. This is that actually was a really common pickup spot for him. Oh,
God. Now it's just like a Target and like a movie theater and restaurants.
Mm-hmm. Nice. Great.
Amazing.
So this is me and Gina. They're in a common grave together, and these are like twin skeletons, like that song from Fall Out Boy.
This is like when you're best friends with someone and you have to get, you know, friends who get murdered together stay together.
Into eternity.
That's so horrible. We don't mean that in any disrespectful way possible, but it's just like, if Danielle and I were going to be murdered, this is how it would happen.
We would get murdered. We would get picked up near Clark and Diversey at the Target and get buried in a grave together.
Right.
Like, that's how we're going to go, TBH, but it's fine.
Yeah.
So his mother, this is a highly controversial thing. So his mother, Sherry Marino, she gets his body identified via dental records and x-rays in 1980. Now, in 2012, Sherry's lawyers revealed that the DNA test that confirmed that the body she buried almost 40 years ago is not that of her son's. Now, the Cook County Sheriff's Office hasn't seen the results from the private company that tested the DNA for the exhumation, so it hasn't been verified.
Okay.
So Edward Pavlik, who is the orthodontist who helped with the work on the identification team, who helps identify most of these victims, he stands by his identification and says that with what he was given, it was a perfect match. And he said he was open to the possibility that maybe the bodies got swapped, but her son is still one of the victims because the DNA was still a match.
That doesn't lie. He's still one of the victims found at the site.
So what we think might have happened is that maybe she buried the wrong body. They might have given her the wrong body, but that doesn't mean that her son is not one of the victims because there was a match. Like, there was a match, like the dental records did match, according to Dr. Pavlik. Like, the records did match. So he's like, okay, maybe there could have been a mistake in terms of the body that you were given, but that doesn't mean that your son wasn't one of the bodies.
Right.
So he was only 14 years old. He's one of the younger victims, too. So there's, like, a couple of 14-year-olds who are in here. And so his best friend, which me and Gina, here we are, his best friend was Kenneth Parker, who was only 16 years old at the time. And his body is identified along with Marino's. And his body was also exhumed in, like, Sherry's quest to kind of prove that her son is not a victim of Gacy's, but it's his friend.
But it's like, why do you want to prove that? Like, what are you going to get out of it? Your son was still murdered. Like, I think it's that kind of like, oh, well, maybe if my son is a Gacy victim, maybe he's gay. Or maybe, you know what I mean? Maybe he's
it could be that, but it also just might be her hope that
she doesn't want to face it.
Was not brutally murdered, that your son can still be out there. I think is kind of what
a mix,
what I think.
You know?
Because that is definitely something that is at play with these bodies. That is definitely something that is at play when these bodies are found, is kind of like, oh my God, if my son is found to be a victim, then that means that, like, oh my God, what if he was gay? What if this? Like, that's definitely something that is at play here, but I think more so what people are scared of when there's sending in DNA to be tested, because you can still send in DNA to be tested for the unidentified victims. What the fear is that your son was brutally murdered. I would rather know that maybe my son is missing and he's out there just trying to stay away from me, or he doesn't know how to come home, or like whatever the case may be. I would be more open to that possibility than my son has been murdered by John Wayne Gacy. So I think that's a little bit of what Sherry's kind of going through, of like, I don't
not wanting to face that reality.
Yeah, like the reality that your son was brutally strangled and murdered is not something that I think that a lot of people can handle.
With his best friend.
With his best
when they're
friend.
out supposed to be having fun as teenagers.
Yeah. So I think that's definitely something that does come into play here. So we're going to end our first episode right here with number 17, who's Kenneth Parker. And we're going to be getting into victims 18 through 33 on the next episode, and along with covering how he's captured and also his death and all of that. So stay tuned for the next episode.
Yes. It's going to be great. Get some popcorn, get some wine, get some coffee, whatever you need to get through it. And we will see you guys in the next episode. Also, make sure to follow Most Hexcellent on Instagram and Twitter. And if you guys have any connections to this case or any Gacy stories, please feel free to DM us on either of those or send us an email to mosthexcellentpod@gmail.com. We would love to hear those stories or any other stories that you have.
Yeah, your stories, or make sure that you are following us. And for our giveaways that are coming up, we have one more giveaway that's coming up in the month of October. So follow us for that giveaway. Also, go register to vote. Please go register to vote. Get out there. There's early voting starting. Please make sure you go vote. And also stay informed on all of the Black Lives Matter causes. Please keep signing petitions. Keep sending money. This still needs to be an issue that we're all staying informed on. It's easy and free to research the legacy of slavery in this country and how it still exists today. And I want to just give one brief shout out to my friend Cassie. Read her blog. It's called The 1995. It's called, like, you can just type in 19, the number, and then 95. That's her blog. Look her up. She's going to Alaska for nice adventures. Friend of the show. We're going to have her on to scare us to death with some of her spooky stories that she has. So I just wanted to give her a shout out. We'll be posting her on our Instagram. So there's that.
Yes. Shout outs for all. We can't wait to talk about this case. And we will see you guys next time. Stay hexcellent. Be hexcellent to each other. Good night.
We'll see you next time.
And goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.